Hello to all of you. I hope that you are doing well. It's been a good day for me. I had my last class session and turned in my last assignment of the semester, so that's a good feeling. Feels like summer is arriving down here, at least in Texas. I'm going to pretty much dive right in. This is session 2 for our Christianity in India series. Last week, if you saw the video or joined the Zoom conversation, you know that we had an introduction to India, thinking about demographics and history and religion and politics. And then turning to Christianity, we talked about the earliest roots in India with Saint Thomas going there, and then the development of the Thomas traditions. In our Zoom conversation on Monday, I talked a little bit more about details about those Thomas tradition churches. Today we're going to continue with some of the historical material, but also give kind of a profile of the church bodies whose histories I go over. We're going to look at Roman Catholicism, which I didn't fit in last time, and we'll also look at Protestantism, including sort of a special section at the end on Pentecostalism, which has an important role and an important history in India as well. Just so you know the game plan going forward, next week I'll focus more specifically on Dalit theology from the untouchables, from the outcast people. And the fourth and the final week, we'll be thinking about what it means for us to be a global church in partnership with each other. So there we'll look specifically at some companion synod relationships. So to begin, we'll talk about Roman Catholicism. And let me just pull up a couple of slides related to that so that we can have some images. So we'll skip forward a fair amount all the way to the year 1498. Which is the year that the Portuguese sailor and explorer and merchant Vasco da Gama landed on the southwest coast of India, actually very close to where I lived in northern Kerala. There's a picture of Vasco da Gama there on the screen. It's the colored picture. Da Gama was the first European to sail around the southern point of Africa and to continue east to India. And thus to discover a sea route to the east. And this, of course, opened up new possibilities for exploration and commerce and kind of global power. This was an expansion that was joined by all sorts of countries, as you may be aware. And you'll see lots of different European countries competing for power through the centuries in India. Just an interesting side note about Portugal, even though we for good reason think about England as being the colonial power, Portugal actually controlled Goa, a small state in the south central part of India, until 1961, I believe, which was 14 years after independence from the British. So just interesting overlapping powers. Portugal, we don't think of as a mighty power, but it had its heyday in the 1500s. So anyway, da Gama's arrival in India was significant. There hadn't been a lot of European movement to the east because of the distance and because Muslims had controlled the routes from Europe to the east. Da Gama was a Roman Catholic, as Europeans were before the Protestant Reformations of the 16th century. And when he and other Europeans after him landed in India, they discovered that there were already Christians there. From very early on, though, the Catholics did not develop warm and cooperative relationships with the other Christians there. These were the Thomas and Syrian Christians, and this brought a fair amount of conflict. Indian Christians were pressured into making a decision about whether they would join the powerful newcomers, the Portuguese, or whether they would sort of double down and insist on keeping their own traditions. And the church, the Syrian and Thomas Christians fractured over this in some ways. Some historians will note that the Portuguese Catholics that showed up and discovered the Indian Christians had a very critical attitude about the Indian Christians. When the Portuguese observed the religious practices of the Indian Christians and learned a little bit about their theology, they grouped them together with heretics. They considered them to be idolaters, just as bad as the Hindus practically. So they pressured hard for those Indian Christians to be brought under the control of Rome. So in the course of years, it became evident that the Portuguese were a force to be reckoned with. And so some Indian people, for primarily political reasons, at least for a certain period of time, opted to convert to Christianity quite early. And many of them did this as whole communities. Probably the most famous group were the Paravar people. They were low-caste fishermen and famous pearl divers in Southeast India in what we now call Tamil Nadu. The Paravars were sort of pinched, caught in between a couple of different powers that were not amenable to them. At sea, the Muslims were in power, and on the land, there was a group called the Nayaka who were in power. And the Paravars were sort of caught in between and didn't have much footing, and they saw alliance with the Portuguese as an opportunity to strengthen their own community life. In this Roman Catholic history, it's important to talk not only about explorers and merchants, but also, of course, about formal missionaries who came quite early on. Perhaps the most famous is Francis Xavier, who came in the 1540s. So that's 40 some years after Vasco da Gama. Xavier was a Spanish missionary who traveled all over Asia. He didn't stay in any one place for all that long, and he eventually died in China, although his remains are in a church in Goa that I have visited. So Xavier came to India in the 1540s, and he was appalled to discover the Christian Paravars, or Paravars who called themselves Christians, but didn't really know the basics of the faith. So he and his associates started a serious campaign for catechization, for Christian education, to help the Paravar people know the ABCs of faith. And it seems to have been a pretty successful effort that Xavier and his Jesuit colleagues undertook. In fact, it attracted other communities and groups, including another fishing community, also low caste like the Paravar people. These were called the Mukavars, and in 1544, 10,000 of them were baptized at the end of the year. Skipping forward about half a century to the year 1606, it's important that we bring up the name of Robert de Nobili, or Roberto de Nobili. He was an Italian Jesuit, and his picture is right above my head. It's the black and white image. And you may or may not be able to see all the details, and I'm not able to identify the significance of all of the details. He has the axe and the chain and the robes. The gist of it, though, is that de Nobili is known, number one, for not reaching out to low caste communities like the fisher folk. Xavier did that earlier on, but de Nobili targeted the upper castes, and especially the Brahmins. The Brahmins had formed a fairly low opinion of the Portuguese, whom they regarded, probably with good reason, as violent, unsophisticated men. So de Nobili sought to change that impression, and he tried to show himself to be a man of impeccable morality, a man of high learning. So he adopted and enculturated a whole lot of high caste Hindu life. He learned the languages. He wrote like Hindu sages and wise men. He dressed like high caste Hindus, and he ate like high caste Hindus did. In this respect, his ministry raises really important questions about the relationship between culture and religion. For him, for de Nobili, caste was part of culture, and it wasn't something essential to the gospel, but it could be continued in Indian Christianity. In fact, de Nobili was so committed to the separation of castes that he believed that there should be separate clergy, separate priests for high castes and low castes. His own preference was for the higher castes because he thought that there could be a trickle-down effect with the lower castes wanting to follow the example of the higher castes. Just for a little bit of analysis of that, and I hope that we can discuss this in our Zoom session, in some ways, I think it's important to acknowledge that this enculturation was good. De Nobili recognized that Western Christians shouldn't expect Indians to become Europeans. That becoming Christian doesn't require that. The problematic element, of course, is that for de Nobili, his work seems to suggest that the truest and best Indian culture is the high caste culture of the Brahmins. And that kept low caste people at the bottom of the ladder. Many of the people observing what de Nobili did in the 1600s were critical of his approach. They thought that he went too far in trying to express Christian ideas in Indian forms. And in fact, a formal complaint was lodged that went all the way to the Pope, and de Nobili ultimately won. It is interesting to note, I think, that Xavier's approach and his focus on the lower caste communities has actually proved to have the most longevity and success. There are not many Indian Christians who trace their lineage to de Nobili, who had the high caste enculturation attempt, but there are lots of active Christians today in India whose work can be traced, whose Christian identity can be traced back to the Pauravars, the Mukhavars, and the work of Xavier. That said, I think de Nobili has a really important legacy, especially when it comes to interfaith dialogue and comparative theology. How do we have compassionate conversations and understanding across religious lines? That's an important task that de Nobili took very seriously. All right, just a quick snapshot of the Roman Catholic Church today. It's the biggest Christian group in India, between 20 and 25 million. Most of them are Catholics that we would recognize. That is, they are part of the Latin Rite, R-I-T-E. And they use the liturgy and the organizational structures and traditions that are part of the Western Roman tradition. But as you may or may not know, there are also many Eastern rites. In fact, 22 Eastern Christian groups that are also part of the Roman Catholic Church, insofar as they recognize the authority of the Pope, but at the same time, they keep their own distinct liturgies and traditions. For instance, in some of these traditions, priests may marry. So those two Eastern Rite Catholics are, first of all, the Syro-Malabars. They have over 4 million members, which, just for comparison's sake, that's a little bit bigger than our ELCA Lutheran church size. And then there's also the Syro-Malankara Catholic Church. They're much smaller, only about 500,000 people. They were only established in the 1930s. As it turns out, I had a connection with them. I took a retreat during probably the spring or summer of 2005, and I went to Kurushumala Ashram. It's actually a Benedictine monastery, just like, for instance, St. John's down at St. John's University in southern Minnesota. But this particular religious community has done a remarkable job of blending together Indian spiritual and monastic traditions with Catholic spiritual and monastic traditions. For instance, they've translated the Syriac liturgy of the Syro-Malankara Catholic Church into Malayalam. They will wear robes of a saffron color, and that fits with ancient Indian contemplative traditions, and the shape of their worship too is much influenced by the contemplative practices of Hindus and Buddhists in India. And then finally, just a word about the Latin Roman Catholics in India. India, in some ways, has a very flourishing Catholic church. There are lots of monks and nuns and monasteries and lots of priests. Many of them serve throughout the world, including many in the States. For those of you who are in Minnesota, I know for a fact that Cass Lake, just east of Bemidji, had an Indian priest. That doesn't necessarily mean that India has too many priests. In some cases, and unfortunately, it is the case that more affluent countries like the US attract some Catholic priests away from India. So there still is need for and work for priests in India, but there are also opportunities for them to go to Europe and North America, where the priest shortages are even more severe. All right, we'll keep on going to Protestantism. I see that I'm going to have to move along a little bit more quickly so that I can stay under half an hour. For Protestantism, we'll start in 1706, when two German Lutheran pietists named Bartholomäus Ziegenbalg and Heinrich Plutschau came to Tamil Nadu under the patronage of the Danish king. You can see a picture of Ziegenbalg. He's got the wig, and he kind of looks like Bach or something in the pictures that we see. And it's fascinating just to see that combination of Tamil script in the top with English. I think this image is actually from a video on YouTube. But Ziegenbalg had a short but still very influential time of ministry in South India. He was an attentive student of Tamil culture. He learned the language very quickly and studied the culture. In this way, he was much like de Nobili. But in his 10 years of ministry, and he died at age 37, he accomplished a great deal. He started schools, he did a lot of translation work, and he established a printing press. Unlike de Nobili, he sought to provide education for the lower castes and not just to the upper castes. And this ended up developing a group of Indian Christian leaders whose stories are often overlooked because, unfortunately, our history of Christianity tends to tell the stories of Western missionaries more frequently than we tell the stories of Eastern or indigenous missionaries. So to remedy that just a little bit, I want briefly to refer to a man named Raja Naikin, an Indian evangelist. He lived from 1700 to 1771. He was a professional soldier. He came from a Christian family. He was the grandson of a Roman Catholic. But he went to the Tranquebar mission, which is where Ziegenbalg was, as part of his deployment. And while there, he got his hands on a copy of Ziegenbalg's Tamil translation of the New Testament, and he was much moved by it, and he became a Lutheran. When he went home to Tanjore, that's another region in South India, he convinced the Indian leader there to open up the region to missionaries. Previously, it had been closed. So here we have a sense of how Indian Christians played an essential role in opening doors that otherwise would have remained closed for Westerners. The European missionaries recognized Rajanaikan's deep faith and abilities, and they considered ordaining him as a pastor. But because he was low caste, specifically a pariah person, the foreigners decided not to ordain him. But Rajanaikan, to his credit, showed a great deal of faithfulness and maturity in that he continued to work tirelessly for the gospel. He trained a lot of younger colleagues. He translated the gospels in ways that were appropriate to the people and fitting with the culture. And he earned a great deal of respect from both Christians and non-Christians. Finally, I will just, for this Protestant story, I want to mention the other person in the picture. It's the picture with two men sitting together at the table. William Carey was an English Baptist, a shoemaker turned missionary who went to India in 1793. He went specifically to the area that we call Calcutta. Today it's pronounced more Kolkata. And he is significant for a lot of reasons. In many cases, he's referred to as the father of modern missions, a period that flourished especially in the 19th century. In December of 1800, after 7 years of missionary labor, Carey baptized his first convert, a man named Krishna Paul, and 2 months later, he published his first Bengali New Testament. Bengali is the language of West Bengal and Bangladesh, and that's the region in which Calcutta is located. Just an interesting side note about this, Carey and his colleagues were just masters of learning languages, and they played an important part in developing modern Bengali. So many of these missionaries wrote the first dictionaries, and they sort of codified and standardized languages in ways that had not occurred up to this point. And in a certain way, this ended up leading to Indian independence. Indian independence and nationalism sort of had its roots in West Bengal, which had a sort of renaissance, thanks in part to the work of Carey and his colleagues and the new interest in language and education. So there are just fascinating ties there between missionary work and the eventual independence of India. There's a lot more that we could say about Carey. I'll just say that he also sought social reform in India, and that included criticizing and seeking to outlaw practices like the killing of infants, and especially the practice of widow burning. The word for that is sati, and that was a practice where wives whose husbands had died were expected to throw themselves on the funeral pyre where their husband was being cremated, to show their loyalty. And this is a practice that has continued in rare cases even into the 20th century, even though it's been outlawed for some time. All right, just a little bit about Protestantism today. There are between 16 and 25 million Protestants today. The picture here is from our Lutheran partners. That's Bishop Sunil in speaking at the mic in the center of the picture. You can see that the white alb and the red stole, the altar in front with the paraments and the candles, it all looks pretty familiar. Protestants in India break down in many ways like they do in the States or other parts of the world. There are the mainline Protestants, including Lutherans, Presbyterians, and Methodists. Some of them have consolidated into a church body called the Church of South India, which is mostly Anglicans, but it also includes Congregationalists, Presbyterians, Reformed, and Methodist Christians. And that in some ways is a remarkable example of how Indian Christians, while they sometimes preserve denominational lines, in other cases they are able to cooperate for the sake of better organization and the benefits that come from that. They are able to cooperate better than many Christians in Christian majority countries. Protestants in India also include evangelical Protestants like Baptists. Many of them are in the northeastern part of India. As I said in the first video, that northeastern part of India is actually predominantly Christian. The missionaries up there tended to be American and Scottish and Welsh, and there are fascinating stories of that history. But for now, I want to move ahead to another branch of Protestantism, and that is Pentecostalism. Pentecostal history has often been overlooked, maybe because its roots don't go as far back in history, and maybe because Pentecostalism for many Christians, and that probably includes uptight and respectable Lutherans, are sort of uncomfortable with Pentecostalism because of its charismatic practices, because the movement of the Spirit in Pentecostalism is so strong, it can be unsettling. But scholars today are spending a lot more time looking at Pentecostalism because it is such a major and influential movement in the world today. Pentecostalism's roots are also often traced to an Azusa Street revival in Los Angeles in 1906. But it turns out, and this is a history that I don't know super well, that Pentecostalism began all across the world in this remarkable global network. One of those starting places was in Wales, where there's a revival between 1904 and 1906, and the Welsh Presbyterians had strong missionary connections with northeastern India, where a charismatic revival started in those years as well. The picture right above my head of the man with the white wrapping around his head, that is a Kasi Christian from the early 1900s who was one of the people involved in the charismatic revival, and he carried that to his own village. And he's just one of many lesser known people who played a part in Pentecostalism's establishment and spreading. The other picture is of Pandita Ramabai. She was a high caste convert who worked as a Christian, especially in Maharashtra. That's the state on the west coast of India where Mumbai or Bombay is. So it's a well-known, and that's where Bollywood is, for instance, if you're familiar with the Indian film industry. She grew up in a family that was famous for having memorized epic poems, and they traveled the country of India reciting those. So she had an amazing mind and amazing ministry. After her conversion, she traveled to Europe and the United States, and eventually back in India, she founded the Mukti Mission, which was especially important in providing care and opportunities for rejected women and girls. And there too, in the Mukti Mission in 1905, there was a glorious Holy Spirit revival, as one historian has put it, and that played a part in catalyzing the movement further. Pentecostalism spread quickly to South India, to Kerala, which I've mentioned before as being such an important place for Indian Christianity. And it's remarkable, especially with Pentecostalism, that very early on, Indians took positions of leadership. With many of the other Indian Christian bodies, it was Westerners who served in the formal seats of power and leadership. that is not as much the case with Pentecostalism in India. So Pentecostal churches can make a legitimate claim to being deeply indigenous and not just foreign churches. So finally, here's just the last slide to think a little bit about Pentecostalism today. There are perhaps 7 million Pentecostals in India today, although many Indian Christians who are not Pentecostals have been influenced by the Pentecostal movement. Lutherans and Catholics in India and elsewhere have been affected by charismatic movements. Indian Pentecostals are part of denominations that some are locally controlled and they're truly Indian. Other Pentecostal denominations are based in the West, like the Assemblies of God, that has congregations all over Texas, Minnesota, and elsewhere. Indian Pentecostals tend to be more theologically and socially conservative than perhaps the mainline Protestants of India. And finally, I just want to say a couple of ways in which Pentecostalism is important, both in India and in general. First, Pentecostalism, of course, has a strong and vibrant sense of the life and the movement and the presence of the Holy Spirit. And that's a part of the Trinity that many Christians sometimes downplay. Second, as I've alluded to, Pentecostalism is both global in its networks and deeply local in its leadership. Further, with its leadership, it's not hierarchical. There's no pope, but by the anointing of the Holy Spirit, any person can become a minister. So in that way, it really recognizes the agency and possibility for all people. So there's sort of what we might call a democratic impulse to Pentecostalism that's really significant. Third, as you may be aware, Pentecostalism in India and elsewhere has highly expressive worship, and that is often stifled elsewhere or just not part of the tradition elsewhere. Many Dalits in India will say that Pentecostal worship, with its drumming, with its room for the heart and for feelings, really fits with Dalit identity. So that's something that we might be able to talk about with Dalit theology next week. Finally, Pentecostalism is significant because it's often a movement among the poor. It's not a church movement that has necessarily sought out or attracted the high and the mighty, but it has given a sense of potential and possibility for the poor. And there too, we have an important connection with Dalit theology. Well, I've gone over the half hour. Apologies for that. But I will wrap it up at this point. You are welcome to join us on Zoom on Monday night at 7:30. Even if you missed the first meeting, that's no problem. If you have questions, comments, feel free to email me at andrew.ronovic@gmail.com. Take care. God's blessings to all of you.